Chapter 10, The Government in the Economy, Taxation and Regulation. What is the optimal size of the government? It's early November and the presidential race is at fever pitch, growing more intense every day. You are beginning to grasp the major issues but are still in need of a bit more information before casting your vote next week. As you eat breakfast, you decide to flip on the TV to learn more about the candidates. You listen to a persuasive argument from the Democratic candidate who is urging businesses to reduce their carbon emissions. She states that if elected, she will propose new taxes on polluters to address the inherent dangers of climate change. Polluters must pay for their pollution. This makes sense to you. Why not levy a tax on polluters to more closely align their interests with those of the society? She closes by confidently stating that now is the time to improve our lives with the helping hand of a government working for you. Later that day, you return home from the economics class and decide to veg out on the couch for a few hours. After this morning's viewing, you are now firmly in the Democratic camp. But when you turn on the TV, this time you see the Republican candidate who is complaining about the inefficiencies created by taxes and the oversized, incompetent government bureaucracy. New pollution taxes will harm all consumers, he claims. He suggests that corruption has become more commonplace in government. Even seemingly honest officials are bamboozling the taxpayer. What we need, he says, is less government intrusion in our lives. He ends with a persuasive line: the beginning of massive government intervention is the end of any great society. Ooh, oh, now you are torn. The candidate was quite convincing, but so was the Democratic one. Which story is correct? You should Who should you believe? Do we need more or less government intervention in the economy? In this chapter, we will learn that by this its a very nature, government intervention can be double-edged sword. Well-designed regulation can improve societal outcomes, but poorly designed regulation stifles economic efficiency. We'll also look at the government we will also look at where the government's money comes from and where it goes, how government intervenes in the economy, and what that intervention costs. Along the way, you will pick up tools that will help you answer the complex question of the optimal role of government in our economy. How much government intervention is necessary? How much is desirable? Key ideas of the chapter. In the United States, governments, federal, state, and local, tax citizens and corporations to correct market failures and externalities, raise revenues, redistribute funds, and finance operations. Through direct regulation and price controls, government can intervene to influence market outcomes. Although government intervention sometimes creates inefficiencies, it often results in improved social well being. Weighing the trade offs between equity and efficiency is one task of an economist. It is up to each individual to decide when and where government intervention makes the most sense. Taxation and government spending in the United States. The federal government is the central government established by the US Constitution. It is the largest governing body in the United States, holding jurisdiction over all 50 states. Yet, when we refer to the government, we do not necessarily mean the federal government. In effect, the federal government collects only about two-thirds of the total taxes in the US economy. There are also state and local governments that impose and collect taxes and spend the revenues they generate. State governments, as the name implies, hold jurisdiction over the particular states. Local governments exist at the country and city levels. They too collect taxes from and spend them in the interest of their respective residents. A single citizen can fall under the jurisdiction of a city government, country government, state government, and federal government simultaneously, and thus owe taxes to each. To appreciate the reach of government in the United States, consider Exhibit 10.1, which plots total government spending and tax revenues. This exhibit shows that the government spending has grown over time and now accounts for more than 40% of the US national income. Notice the spike in the mid 1940s, which shows a substantial increase in the government spending due to World War II. Tax revenues have also grown in tandem. For example, in 2011, the government tax revenues stood at $2,651.4 billion. It may be hard to believe that such massive tax revenues fall short of spending, but Exhibit 10.1 shows that this is often the case. When government tax revenues fall below spending, the government runs a budget deficit. When the converse happens and tax revenues exceed spending, the government is running a budget surplus. Where does the money come from? Exhibit 10.2 provides a summary of how the federal government raises revenues. In 2011, for example, the federal government collected over 2,311 billion dollars in tax revenues or receipts, which is equivalent to about $15,044 per person in the labor force. These receipts are collected via various types of taxes as shown in the exhibit. First, individual income taxes represent the largest portion, roughly 47% in 2011. Second, payroll taxes represent about a third of the federal government's receipts. A payroll tax, also known as social insurance tax, is a tax on wages that employers are required to withhold from employees' pay. On your pay stub, these are often listed as Federal Insurance Contribution Act taxes or FICA taxes. Third, corporate income tax provides 7% of the overall pie. Corporate income tax is generated from taxing profits earned by corporations. Fourth, all other taxes make up the remaining 9%. This includes excise taxes, which are taxes paid when purchasing specific goods such as alcohol, tobacco, and gasoline. The sources of revenue for state and local governments are quite different from those of the federal government. Exhibit 10.3 displays the types of taxes laid by these governments and the receipts brought in by each. The pie chart of the revenue in the exhibit is split into 5 pieces. First, the largest slice of the pie is at 30% is the all other category, which encompasses miscellaneous taxes and fees that state and local governments collect. These include, among others, tolls on roads, sales from public transportation, tickets, vehicle licenses, and hunting and fishing licenses. Second, the next biggest portion at 25% is revenue from the federal government, which are taxes collected at the federal level and then redistributed to the states, often used to redistribute resources towards poorer states with otherwise relatively low receipts. Third, sales tax account for the next largest portion at 18%. Unless you live in one of the few states that does not have a sales tax, you are likely quite familiar with sales tax, which are calculated as a percentage of the sale price of an item and are usually collected from a buyer by a seller at the time of sale. The seller then passes the tax on to the proper government agencies. Some items, such as basic necessities, are exempt from sales tax. These exemptions are determined independently by each state and local government. The value added tax is similar to the sales tax, except that is imposed at the each stage of the production process leading up to the final sale rather than being entirely collected at the time of sale of the final good. At 17% of tax revenues, property taxes also contribute a robust slice of revenues. These are taxes on land and structures on which local governments rely to fund schools, libraries, and public services such as police and fire protection. Similar to the federal government, 43 state governments and many local governments collect individual income taxes. These amounted to 11% of the total receipts in 2011. Though the type of tax is the same, each state's rates vary and are generally less than the federal individual income tax rates. The 7 states that do not collect any income taxes are Alaska, Florida, Nevada, South Dakota, Texas, Washington, and Wyoming. In addition, New Hampshire and Tennessee only tax dividend and interest income. Before you plan your next big move, however, keeping in mind that these states tend to make up for not taxing income with higher tax rates in other categories or lower provision of public goods. Some state and local governments also collect corporate income taxes, though this category accounts for a much smaller share of receipts, 2.5% in 2011. Why does the government tax and spend? There are 4 main factors underlying government taxation and spending decisions: raising revenues, redistributing income via transfer payments, financing operations, correcting market failures and externalities. Raising revenues. Most taxation in our economy is intended to raise revenues for the funding of public goods such as national defense, public education, police protection, and infrastructure projects. We saw in Chapter 9 that markets will in general fail to provide optimal amounts of public goods. This failure in turn motivates governments to levy taxes and use the returns for the provision of public goods which benefit a large number of citizens. Exhibit 10.4 provides a summary of how federal government revenue is spent and shows the national defense and social security comprise the 2 largest categories of federal spending. The federal government does not spend a large fraction of its budget on education, policing, and infrastructure, which are all included in the other category. but this state and local governments do, as we see in Exhibit 10.5. Exhibit 10.5 indicates that 27% of state and local government spending went toward public education, which includes schools from kindergarten all the way up to the state universities. Large fractions of these state and local receipts were also spent on highways, one type of infrastructure spending. Policing, together with firefighting, libraries, transportation, parks, and sewage, were included in the other category. Redistributing funds. The second major objective of government taxation and spending is redistribution. As we discuss in the next chapter, market outcomes can be quite inequitable, with high levels of inequality and poverty coexisting alongside huge fortunes for a few. Governments in all advanced economies in general, and the US government in particular, use transfer payments and the tax system to limit the extent of such inequality and the economic hardships that poorer households in the society suffer. Transfer payments. These payments refer to payments from the government to certain individual groups, such as the elderly or the unemployed, which are not made as a payment for the provision of a good or service. In Exhibit 10.4, you can see that after national defense spending, the bulk of federal government spending is made up of the payments under the umbrella of Social Security, Medicare, and health. Social Security, also known as Old Age, Survivors, and Disability Insurance Program, is the largest transfer program and was introduced by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1935 to provide economic security to the elderly, disabled widows, and fatherless children. Medicare, introduced by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965, provides health insurance to Americans aged 65 and above, makes up another large part of federal spending. Income security includes unemployment compensation, supplemental security income, the refundable portion of the earned income, and the child tax credits. Food stamps, also known as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, family support, child nutrition, and foster care. Health comprises such major mandatory programs as Medicaid, the state children's health insurance program, federal employees and retirees' health benefits, and health care for Medicare eligible military retirees. Exhibit 10.5 shows that public welfare also makes up a significant part of state and local budgets. This item consists of transfer payments to person in need, including direct cash assistance under the old age assistance and temporary assistance for needy families programs, vendor payments made to private purveyors for medical care, burials, and other services provided under welfare programs, as well as payments to other governments for welfare purposes. In addition to transfer payments, governments rely on progressive income taxes to limit inequality and distribute the tax burden more toward the shoulders of the rich. A progressive tax system is one in which tax rates increase with taxable base incomes so that the rich pay higher tax rates than the less well do. To understand this system more precisely, we need to distinguish between average and marginal tax rates. The average tax rate faced by a household is the total tax paid divided by total income earned. The marginal tax rate, on the other hand, refers to how much of the last dollar earned the household pays in taxes. The United States has a progressive federal income tax system in that high income individuals pay higher average taxes and higher marginal taxes. The letting the data speak box illustrates the relationship between marginal and average tax rates in a progressive system using federal tax information from 2013. Exhibit 10.7 shows an important consequence of a progressive tax system. The rich earn a high share of national income but pay even a higher share of total taxes. For example, the richest 1% earns 14.9% of national income but also pays 24.2% of the total federal taxes. People between the 60th and 80th percentiles of the income distribution, on the other hand, pay about the same percentage in taxes as they earn, while those in the bottom 60% of the earnings distribution pay less in taxes than their percentage of the national income. The alternatives to the progressive tax system are the proportional and regressive tax systems. In a proportional tax system, households pay the same percentage of their incomes in taxes regardless of their income level. In other words, the marginal and average tax rates do not vary with income. In a regressive tax system, the marginal tax and average tax rates decline with income so that the low income households pay a greater percentage of income in taxes than do high income households. Exhibit 10.8 provides example of progressive, proportional, and regressive taxes. In the United States, income taxes are progressive and social security and property taxes tend to be regressive. As a result of transfer programs and progressive taxation, the post tax income distribution in the United States is more equal than the pre tax income distribution. We depict this in Exhibit 10.9, which plots the pre tax and post tax income shares of the top rich 1% and the lowest 20% of the households in the United States. Even though these figures do not include the transfer payments related to healthcare, they already indicate that government redistribution reduces inequality by a significant amount. For example, in 2010, the pre tax income share of the lowest 20% of US households was 5.1%, while their post tax income share was 6.2%. The pre tax income share of the top 1% of US households was 14.9%, while their post tax income share was 12.8%. Financing operations. Governments also tax to pay for their own operations, including the salaries of presidents, congressmen, and other politicians, and for the sizable bureaucracy in charge of the day to day running of government operations and services. Some economists, such as William Niskanen, argue that politicians and government bureaucrats have a tendency to increase government revenues and their size independent of more useful roles of government listed above. Though most economists and social scientists would not agree that this is the major driver of government size, many would agree that certain parts of the government bureaucracy are inefficiently large. We return to this issue later in this chapter. Correcting market failures and externalities. In chapter 9, we saw how the government sometimes imposed taxes to correct market failures or externalities. Though important in principle, most taxes in practice are not imposed to deal with a specific market failure or externality, but because of one of the other three factors listed above. Because of this, the fact that we discussed Pigovian taxes in chapter 9, we focus on the other three factors in this chapter: taxation, incidence, and deadweight losses. Who bears the burden of taxes? Meaning, who actually pays the tax? At first glance, the answer to the question of who bears the tax burden seems obvious. Whoever is taxed bears the burden. If a tax is imposed on a consumer, then the consumer bears it. If it's imposed on the sellers, producers, they bear it. But we will learn in this section that interestingly enough, things that are not simple, the tax burden can be shared between a buyer and a seller even if it seems to fall on just one of them. The term tax incidence refers to how the burden of the tax is distributed across various agents in the economy. To illustrate, let's consider city government officials in New Orleans who want to raise money to build a park next to the Bourbon Street. Understanding that the local restaurants are doing well, they decide to levy a tax of $2 on every plate of jambalaya being sold per day. Every time a restaurant sells a plate of jambalaya, it must send $2 to the city government. Let's see how this tax on sellers affect market outcomes. Panel A of Exhibit 10.10 shows that the market demand and market supply of jambalaya plates and the pre-tax equilibrium, which involves a daily quantity of 4,000 plates of jambalaya being sold at the equilibrium price of $6.50 a plate. Panel B in Exhibit 10.10 shows what happens when a tax of $2 per plate is imposed on the sellers. We include a virtual supply curve to show that the post-tax supply curve. We see that at every quantity level, the post tax supply curve is $2 higher than the old supply curve. To understand why, note that with $2 from the sale of every plate going to the government, the sellers are receiving 2% less than the sale price. For example, if the sale takes place at $6.50, they get not this amount but only $4.50. But then, after the tax at $6.50, they will be willing to supply only what they would have supplied at $4.5 on the original supply curve. Panel B shows that the tax reduces the quantity of chambalya plates purchased per day from 4,000 to 2,500 and raises the equilibrium price to $7.50 a plate. This means that after the 2% in tax, the seller now receives $5.5 and market supply is 2,500 plates. Can you see what is happening here? First, there is a gap of $2 between what the consumer pays and what the supplier receives, resulting from the $2 tax on jambalaya plates. Second, not all of this falls on the restaurants. The consumer is paying $1 more per plate and half the $2 tax burden, and the supplier is receiving $1 less per plate, thus bearing half of the tax burden. This change in market equilibrium affects consumer and producer surpluses as shown in the panel B of Exhibit 10.10. Consumer surplus is now given by the blue shaded area labeled CS, and producer supplier surplus is given by the pink shaded area PS. The green area represents the portion of revenues that producers pass on the government. This is the tax revenue and it's equal to the size of the tax multiplied by the number of plates sold. In this case, with the $2 tax, 2,500 plates are served per day at a price of $7.5, the intersection point of D and S tax. So daily tax revenues are given by 2,500 into $2, that is equal to $5,000. This decomposition in panel B also shows that the yellow triangle, which was part of consumer and producer surplus before the tax, is now part of neither. Nor does it accrue to the government as revenue. It therefore represents the deadweight loss of the taxation. The deadweight loss of taxation is the loss of total is the deadweight loss of taxation is the loss in total surplus, or put differently, the decline in consumer and producer surpluses not made up by the increase in tax revenues due to the gap that the tax has created between the price received by the sellers and the price paid by the consumers. In this example, this gap is exactly equal to the $2 tax. The deadweight loss can be computed easily by using the formula for the area of a triangle, half into half into base, that is change in quantity, multiply by height, that is tax. In our case, this is equal to half into $2 into 1500 is equal to $1,500. To understand tax incidence, we turn up to panel C of exhibit 10.10. Here we see that the government has taken the portion of pre-tax consumer surplus labeled incidence on consumers. We calculate this by finding the portion of tax revenue that lies above the pre-tax equilibrium price of $6.5. This portion of tax revenue used to be part of consumer surplus, but it is no longer part of it. Thus, it represents the incidence of taxes on consumers. Similarly, the portion of tax revenue that lies below the pre-tax equilibrium is the incidence of the tax on producers. The portion of the tax revenue that is lost producer surplus. This results show that although the tax is placed on sellers of Chambalya, both buyers and sellers bear its burden. In fact, in the example we have shown in Exhibit 10.10, the incidence on consumers is equivalent to 50% of the tax, even though the tax was placed on sellers. Let's return to the government officials in New Orleans who now face another challenge. After the is in place for only a few months, the local merchants begin to clamor. They are unhappy with paying the $2 tax. In a town hall meeting, the merchants hatch a seemingly clever plan. Because most of our patrons are from out of town, let's the tax buyers $2 for every plate of jambalya that they purchase. This way, they, not us, will pay for our new park. The town officials, anxious to placate the restaurant owners, think this is a great idea. They immediately repeal the tax on restaurants and impose it on consumers. They conclude that since buyers are now responsible for paying the tax, sellers should be much better off. Is this true? Exhibit 10.11 helps us to answer this question. In panel A of the exhibit, we see that $2 tax on every plate of jambalya creates a new demand curve for jambalya labeled D tax. We construct with virtual demand by subtracting $2 from the price associated with every quantity on the pre-tax demand curve D. Indeed, now when producers charge $5.5 consumers in addition to have to pay a tax of $2 and thus face a total cost of $7.5, we can once again calculate the new equilibrium, the deadweight losses, and tax incidence. Upon doing so, you will see that the equilibrium quantity is the same as in panel B of the exhibit 10.10. 2,500 plates are sold per day, consumers pay $7.5 and suppliers get $5.5 per plate. And here is the important point. The deadweight loss, again represented by the yellow triangle, is also identical, equal to $1,500. Let's again compute tax incidence, the incidence on consumers. The portion of tax revenue that lies above the pre-tax equilibrium price is given by the same green triangle. The incidence on the producers, the portion of the tax revenue that lies between the pre-tax equilibrium, is also through the same green triangle. Remarkably, the outcome is identical to the case in which the tax was imposed on producers. We seem to have stumbled across a conundrum. Notice that the incidence of the tax on the producers doesn't change even though under the original tax system Jambalya producers had to pay the government, whereas in the new tax system consumers have to pay the government. Why doesn't it change? It's because in the first case, when the producers of jambalaya were taxed, menu prices rose from $6.5 to $7.5. Thus, consumers paid $7.5 per plate, and producers' net revenue was $5.5 per plate. In the second case, when consumers are directly taxed, the equilibrium menu price decreases to $5.5 because of the consequence of the tax. Thus, again, producers receive $5.5 per plate in the net revenues, but because of the tax, consumers pay a total of $7.5 for every dish of jambalaya they consume. We are encountering a general phenomena here. In competitive markets, tax incidence and equilibrium prices and quantities are independent of whether the tax is imposed on consumers or producers. The effects of demand and supply elasticities on the tax burden. The fact that the incidence of the tax is identical for buyers and sellers in the examples above is due to how we drew the market demand and market supply curves. That is, buyers and sellers were equally as sensitive to price changes at the original equilibrium. However, in general, the elasticity of market demand will not be identical to the elasticity of market supply. Exhibit 10.12 provides an illustrative example. Panel A of the exhibit shows the market for jambalaya using the same figures as in the example above. In panel B of the exhibit, we make the market supply curve more elastic than the market demand curve. This means that sellers are more responsive to price changes than the buyers. Panel B reveals that when the supply curve becomes more elastic, a smaller portion of tax revenues lies below the pre-tax market price. So buyers bear more of the tax burden because the market supply curve is more elastic than the market demand curve. What would happen if we reverse the situation and make the demand curve more elastic than the supply curve? Exhibit 10.13 provides an answer now. It is the producer who bears more of the burden of the tax. This leads us to a general rule. The tax burden falls less heavily on the side of the market that is more elastic, that is more responsive to price changes. When supply is more elastic than demand, the tax burden falls more heavily on buyers. When the demand is more elastic than supply, the tax burden falls more heavily on sellers. The intuition behind why this is true revolves around what an elasticity measures. Recall that when buyers are more price elastic, they have more alternatives to turn to. Thus, when the price rises, they can easily switch to purchasing another good. If buyers are price inelastic or not sensitive to price changes, they have few goods alternatives. Thus, they must swallow the higher price and continue to purchase the text good despite the higher price. This means that the more elastic buyer will bear less of the price increase than the less elastic buyer. The same logic applies to the producer side. There is another impact of elasticities on tax burden which can also be seen from exhibits 10.12 and 10.13. As supply or demand becomes more price elastic, the deadweight loss of taxation increases. This means that the greater the price elasticity of either supply or demand, the greater the deadweight loss, all things become being equal. The deadweight loss depends on the tax. The deadweight losses of taxation imply that for every dollar of tax raised, the cost is greater than a dollar. That is what economist Arthur Ocon called the leaky bucket. The government finds that it must pour in more than 1 gallon of revenue to finance 1 gallon of services. But some types of taxes might create fewer leakages than others. Lump sum taxes, which are taxes that require every citizen to pay the same amount regardless of his or her circumstances, typically create fewer leakages than taxes on income or transactions. This is because they do not introduce the gap that leads to the deadweight loss of taxation shown in exhibit 10.10 and 10.11. Imagine that the government imposed a lump sum tax on all residents of New Orleans rather than the tax on plates of jambalaya. Then the equilibrium in the jambalaya market would not be subject to the tax distortions we saw there. With lump sum taxes, all citizens in economy would pay the government the same fee, say $5,000, regardless of their earnings or market demand. Such taxes do not distort behavior, and therefore there is no deadweight loss associated with imposition of such taxes. Although such taxes are rare, there are examples in practice. For example, during the third administration of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the government in Great Britain enacted a law in 1989 requiring local authorities to replace their system of local property taxes with a lump sum head or poll tax. Every adult would now pay the same amount of tax called the community charge to the local government with the amount determined by each locality. In practice, these types of taxes are rarely used because they go against one of the major objectives of the government's redistribution. As we have seen, governments often tax so as to redistribute away from the rich and toward the poor and disabled or the elderly. But lump sum taxes force rich and poor people to pay the same amount and thus incur a higher tax rate on the poor. They are thus regressive taxes. Regulation. The main tool that governments use to deal with externalities and other market failures is regulation, including direct regulation and price controls. Regulation refers to actions by the federal or local government directed at influencing market outcomes, such as quantity traded of a good or service, its price, or safety. This also may involve antitrust activities preventing some firms from exercising excessive monopoly power, as well as the activities that are useful for enforcing laws and property rights and resolving disputes to improve the market allocation of resources. We saw in Chapter 9 how the government can use We saw in Chapter 9 how the government can use Pigovian taxes and subsidies to correct externalities. In many instances, however, the government often directly regulates the activity that creates negative externalities. For example, governments typically prevent firms from dumping hazardous waste into rivers rather than simply taxing them. Governments also often use regulation to limit the market power of certain firms, which, by creating a departure from competitive markets, constitutes another major source of market failures, as we discuss in Chapter 12. In this section, we look at direct regulation and price controls as used by the governments to affect market outcomes. Direct regulation. A common form of government intervention in markets is direct regulation or command and control regulation, as discussed in Chapter 9 in regards to pollution. Direct regulation or command and control regulation refers to a direct action by the government to control the amount of a certain activity. Direct regulations affect just about every walk of life, from the safety of foods and drugs to the miles per gallon our automobiles achieve to when we drop out of school. In many cases, such regulations serve important purposes. For example, consider a prominent regulator of the quality of goods, the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA represents one of the most complex bureaucracies in the United States, employing 9,000 people and operating on a budget of approximately $2 billion per year. It is not a perfect organization. Far from it, it is often blamed, sometimes deservedly, for being slow to allow new drugs to reach the market as rapidly as they should. Nevertheless, the FDA does play an important role. It makes sure that drugs that are marketed do, in fact, have the functions that they are supposed to have. The FDA is also charged with preventing fly by night companies from selling snake oil, so to speak, to unsuspecting consumers. This type of regulation aimed at ensuring that complex products meet certain quality and disclosure requirements would be different to leave to the market itself, as it would be costly for each consumer to obtain such information. If each consumer had an individually if each consumer had to individually verify that a drug was safe to take it, it would lead to a massive duplication of effort. Though regulation plays an indispensable role in modern society, it has costs and limitations. Consider a quick thought experiment on quantity regulations. Quantity regulations, which include fishing quotas, zoning restrictions, anti smoking laws, and blue laws that restrict liquor sales on Sundays, can be found throughout any market economy. Let's assume now that the government determines that there is shortage of physicists. In fact, it pronounces that because of the positive externalities that physicists bestow on society, we should have 5,000 more of them. It proceeds to use quantity regulation to choose 5,000 people to become physicists without any market mechanism to guide those choices. Would this approach yield an efficient result? Likely not. Unlike market forces that guide resources to their best use, this type of command system would probably fail miserably. The reason is that a gifted artist or a dedicated bond trader might be forced into a career solving complicated mathematical equations for which they have no particular talent. As we learned in Chapter 9, a Pigouvian subsidy is a very viable alternative because it uses market forces to encourage people at the margin to internalize the externality. If there is an appropriately chosen subsidy to becoming a physicist, then it won't be random people who choose to enter physics, because those who had the talent to become a physicist and yet were previously indifferent between, say, a career as a bond trader and one as a physicist, thus attracting the right people into this profession. Price controls. Price ceilings and price floors. As we discussed in Chapter 7, sometimes the government intervenes in a market directly by selling a maximum or minimum price for which goods and services sell. Such intervention to regulate prices is called price controls. Here we examine two different types of price controls: price ceiling and price floors. Price ceilings. A price ceiling is a cap on the price of a market good or service. One important example is rent control, referring to the maximum amount of landlords can charge renters or the maximum amount by which they can increase rent. Rent controls are often introduced partly as a redistributive tool because renters are typically poorer than the landlords and wind up spending a large portion of their incomes on rent. In the United States, rent controls began during World War I and remain in many cities today, including the New York City, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. The idea of rent control is noble. However, economic analysis shows that rent control does create important inefficiencies. Some of these may help potential renters and others may not. Thus, a careful economic analysis is necessary for evaluating the benefits and costs of rent control. Consider the case of small apartments in San Francisco. In an effort to help renters, let's say that the local government places a price control on apartments in the form of a price ceiling. You can see in Exhibit 10.14 that without rent control, the equilibrium is a rent of $1,200 per month and 4,000 apartments are rented. Now consider a rent control imposing a price ceiling of $750 per month. Where are the implications of this regulation? Exhibit 10.14 helps us answer this question. At $750 per month, shown by the black line, the quantity supplied decreases to 2,500 units. At this lower rent, quantity demanded has increased to 5,500 units. In consequence, there is now a shortage of 3,000 apartment units at the price of $750. Landlords won't supply as many apartments at the lower rate of $750 as they would at the price of $1,200. For instance, at $750 rather than rent, they might use some apartments as a secondary residence for themselves. At the same time, more renters will want to rent at lower price because there won't be as many apartments available. There is excess demand. What we conclude is that the price ceiling has caused an inefficiently low quantity of apartments to be available. As we discussed in Chapter 7, this shortage caused by the government imposed rent control carries a cost, a dead weight loss. Panel A of Exhibit 10.15 shows consumer and producer surplus before the government imposes a price ceiling. Panel B shows the situation after government imposed regulation, assuming that among the renters, those with a greater willingness to pay are first in the line to get an apartment. Under this assumption, the 2,500 units go to the 2,500 consumers with the highest willingness to pay. The resulting deadweight loss is shown by yellow triangle in the exhibit. You might ask yourself, if rent controls is so clearly welfare reducing, why do we have it in practice? One reason is that it does not reduce everybody's welfare. As you can see by comparing panels A and B in Exhibit 10.15, consumer surplus is higher under the rent control panel B than without rent control panel A. In addition, if those renters are also poor and the government wished to redistribute income from more well to do landlords towards this group, rent control will have achieved this goal. But of course, some renters are hurt by the rent control. Fewer of them are now able to find an apartment. Moreover, rent control may discourage landlords from maintaining apartments, since a very poorly maintained apartment will find takers in the market with a shortage of apartments. When price ceilings have no bite. Consider what would happen if a large manufacturing plant in Oakland expanded and hired thousands of workers from San Francisco. Now, many people want to live in Oakland rather than San Francisco. The demand curve for rental units in San Francisco shifts leftwards as shown in Exhibit 10.16. This shift of the demand curve leads to an equilibrium market price of $600 corresponding to the intersection of the new demand curve and the original supply curve. Now the government regulation has no bite because this price is below the price ceiling of $750. As you can see in Exhibit 10.16, the only time price ceilings have an effect on the market is when they are below the market clearing price. Price floors. Sometimes the government steps in to impose a minimum price on a product or service. The result is a price floor which represents a lower limit on the price of the product or service. A prominent example of price floors is that of minimum wage requirements. Minimum wage laws were first enacted in New Zealand in 1894, and now more than 90% of all the countries have them. In the United States, the federal government has set a minimum wage of $7.25 per hour, meaning that it is the lowest wage an employer may pay a worker. Workers receiving tip income can be paid $2.13 per hour. Several states have minimum wage laws prescribing that within their boundaries, employers have to pay even more. For example, in the state of Illinois, employers must pay workers at least $8 per hour. A price floor has similar implication to those of a price ceiling, except that instead of a shortage, a price floor causes a surplus. Quantity supplied at a price floor would typically be greater than the quantity demanded. Because price floors tend to keep the price artificially high, surplus is shifted from consumers to producers. Thus, a price floor not only has deadweight loss but also reallocates surplus to sellers. Government failures. We have now seen several ways in which governments may intervene in the economic system. Though many of these interventions have well defined, worthy objectives and some of them are essential for the proper functioning of markets, we have seen that they also create a range of inefficiencies that need to be taken into account. Those include deadweight losses of taxation or inefficiencies from price controls or direct regulations. Those who hold the role of the government in the economy should be minimized, emphasize not only these costs but also a broader set of inefficiencies associated with government interventions, sometimes also called government failures, which need to be weighed against the market failures that the government are correcting. In this section, we outline some of these costs. The direct costs of bureaucracies. Each government program needs bureaucrats and bureaucracies to monitor its implementation. Bureaucrats have to be paid. They are also taken out of the productive sectors of the economy. That is, instead of working at a manufacturing plant or as a manager at Amazon.com, the bureaucrats are engaged in regulation or tax collection. This observation does not suggest that bureaucrats are unproductive at what they do. They implement regulation. However, in the absence of regulation, these workers would have been productive in other jobs, and this lost production represents the opportunity cost of the government work. In this way, the allocation of time and talent of individuals to bureaucracy is an important cost of government. This cost is increased by the fact that bureaucracies sometimes don't function efficiently. Though the various government agencies employ many well intentioned and efficient individuals, there are long lines, arbitrary decisions, and always a few not so helpful employees. These are the kinds of inefficiencies we have to expect from big bureaucracies. Government intervention in the form of direct regulation may also entail some similar costs as firms and their employees work to meet certain government set objectives rather than creating goods and services. Corruption. Equally as important as the deadweight loss associated with government intervention and inefficiencies of bureaucracies is the corruption that the large government engender. Corruption ref Corruption refers to the misuse of public funds or the distortion of the allocation of resources for personal gain. Consider one example: the billions of dollars that go annually to African governments as foreign aid. In the last 60 years, more than $1 trillion has been transferred from developed countries to Africa, and foreign aid to all countries in 2011 exceeded $130 billion. Much of it comes from the governments of developed nations and a significant portion from charities. But only a small fraction of this money ever reaches its target audience. Economists have estimated that the amount of money that actually reaches its intended destination may be as little as from 5% to 15%. That means as little as a nickel of every dollar that you send reaches the recipient. Some of the lost aid is eaten up by the inefficiencies of the bureaucracies that operate the foreign aid machine, and even more is appropriated by corrupt politicians and bureaucrats. For example, a recent study found that only 13% of education grants reached schools, and most schools received no aid in Uganda. This type of corruption is extreme but not unusual. You might be thinking that corruption is not an issue in developed countries, where there is this good system of checks and balances and watchdog agencies waiting for a public official to misstep are everywhere. The evidence suggests otherwise. For instance, in the United States, corruption is not difficult to find. In 2008, 15 sitting congressmen or senators and 9 former members of the Senate or the House of Representatives were under criminal investigation, mostly for inappropriately using public funds or gifts from businesses that constituted conflicts of interest. If we consider the number of convictions of public officials across states, similar insights are gained. For instance, from 1977 to 1987, there were roughly 800 corruption convictions per year. The most corrupt state, New York, has had roughly 50 times more corruption convictions than the average state during that time period. Such corruption levels continue unabated across states today. In 2008, the Department of Justice reported that 1,129 federal, state, and local employees had been convicted on corruption charges. In spite of recent drama, New York is no longer the heavyweight champion of corruption, though Florida actually leads all the states in convictions from 1999 to 2008. All in all, we cannot expect the government to function as seamlessly as the exhibits in this chapter indicate. The government will often make mistakes, the bureaucracy will be inefficient and slow, the politicians can be corrupt, seeking to capture the process of decision making and exploiting it for their own benefits or their own ideological ends. When evaluating government policies, these costs of government have to be considered. How these costs weigh under the benefits of government determine a large degree whether the government is a night watchman or a central commander of resources. Underground economy. You have likely seen lawn care workers, snow shovelers, and babysitters handed cash for their work. Or you may have a waiter friend who makes killer tips but does not report them on his taxes. The underground economy, sometimes also referred to the black market, includes activities such as those above, where income taxes are not paid, as well as illegal activities such as drug dealing and prostitution. In most modern economies, black markets cover an array of activities and are generally found in areas where the benefits of such activities are the highest, either because of the tax rates either because of the high tax rates or because the activity is illegal and therefore the good is not provided in the formal market. One prime example of an underground economy created because of an illegal product was result of prohibition in the 1920s. After the United States outlawed alcohol in 1919, smugglers arranged deliveries to speakeasies and private bars. The result was an era of big organized crime. Think of AI Capone and an estimated $500 million in lost tax revenues annually. Such an example illustrates some of the problems that an underground economy generates. When they involve goods and services that they have been illegally banned, the underground economy undermines the ban. When the underground transactions occur in markets for legal goods and services in order to avoid taxes or regulations, they put legitimate businesses at a disadvantage. To compensate for the lost revenue, the governments must levy high taxes. Criminals spend vast resources trying to evade the law, and authorities spend resources to catch criminals, which are not effectively uses of society's resources. Equity versus efficiency. It is worth emphasizing that despite all these government failures, government intervention often plays important social roles, such as redistributing resources to ensure a more equitable society. The core issue when governments redistribute resources, fully recognizing that this does entail some inefficiencies, revolves around the equity efficiency trade off. The equity efficiency trade off refers to the trade off between ensuring an equitable allocation of resources and increasing the social surplus or total output. Most would agree that equity and efficiency are the two most important goals for government policy. Exhibit 10.17 depicts the typical trade off society faces. What it shows is that the two goals, equity and efficiency, are often but not always in conflict. When social inequality is high, above the point marked A in the exhibit 1, in the exhibit further increases this inequality reduce social surplus. As we move up from the vertical axis, further increasing social inequality, we also move down the horizontal axis, reducing social surplus. This could be for several reasons. For example, greater social inequality prevents some people from competing with others on a level playing field or increases conflict in society, creating distortions via this channel. But for levels of social inequality below point A, further declines inequality also come at the cost of lower social surplus, for example, because of the deadweight losses involved in redistributive taxation. Now, as we limit social inequality moving down the vertical axis, we also move down the horizontal axis, reducing social surplus. This trade off between equity and efficiency represents the nub of the conflict between those who support big government and those who call for smaller government. Where do you want to be along this curve? This is a decision problem that social welfare maximizing governments have to confront. But economic analysis informs us on how the government can do this best. For instance, economic analysis helps us understand where point A is located, beyond which there is no trade-off between reducing social inequality and reducing social surplus. Below this point, however, the choice crucially depends on value judgments. Some people would prefer to live in a fairly efficient society even if this comes at the cost of considerable social inequality. Others would be willing to put up with greater inefficiencies and a lower social surplus in order to achieve greater equality. In a broad sense, the portion of the curve between the original and point A represents the dividing line between Democrats and Republicans. Presidents Clinton and Obama have emphasized the importance of reducing social inequality, for example, arguing that the rich need to pay more in taxes. President Reagan and George W. Bush, on the other hand, have argued that high rates distort decisions and have opted for tax reforms based on efficiency grounds. The actual fact is that all developed nations have seek to achieve some degree of equality in their society. The welfare state refers to the set of insurance, regulation, and transfer programs utilized to create a safety net, reduce poverty, and redistribute income from the rich to the poor. In the United States, for example, the welfare state comprises several programs such as Medicaid and food stamps, which are targeted to the poor. The welfare state is even more expensive in Europe. Despite the deadweight loss associated with such systems, many European nations have choose to promote more some degree of equality in income. Consumer sovereignty and paternalism. Beyond promoting equality, some economists have argued that government intervention is necessary because individuals may suffer from decision errors or may find it difficult to evaluate certain choices. For example, many people do not have the finance background necessary to navigate the world of retirement savings account options. In such situations, they can make mistakes that are costly to themselves. Should the government try to prevent them from making such mistakes? One answer as to whether the government should engage in these types of actions relates to the concept of consumer sovereignty. Consumer sovereignty is the view that choices made by a consumer reflect his or her true preferences, and outsiders, including the government, should not interfere with these choices. Some economists argue that we should evaluate all resource allocations according to the preferences of consumers at the time they make a decision. If those preferences are wrong or turn out to be wrong after the fact, so be it. At the other end of the spectrum is paternalism. Paternalism is the view that consumers do not always know what is best for them, and the government should encourage or induce them to change their actions. Many crucial reformers who played important roles in the founding of the welfare state, from William Beveridge in the United Kingdom to Franklin Roosevelt and Johnson in the United States, hold this view. This approach gives the government an active hand in helping individuals make the right decisions and in designing choices so that people make the right decisions when they are unlikely to do so by themselves. The social security system in the United States, which forces individuals to save for old age, is born out of paternalism. Laws that ban substance abuse are also motivated in, in part by paternalism. By contrast, in a world with no externalities, consumer sovereignty would allow individuals to consume as many drugs as possible, even if they are addictive and potentially harmful. In fact, the big differences between paternalism and consumer sovereignty is again a normative one. How much do we value consumer sovereignty in and of itself? And how much do we want to allow the government to interfere in individual decision making? It's a murky area. Nevertheless, economists find their voices on both sides of the debate. We briefly review both sides now. The debate. Those economists toward the paternalistic end of the spectrum would probably say that some mistakes simply result from the fact that individuals are not used to making decisions of a certain type. For example, most people, when first confronted with investing in the stock market, may not understand the implications of their decisions. One role of this economics course is to educate you in economic decision making. In the same way, those who want government to take an active role would approve the government's provision of information so that people can make better decisions. In their view, this is not a violation of consumer sovereignty. In fact, it corresponds to a strengthening of it because better decisions are a result of better information. Some economists go somewhat further and suggest that the government should also play the role of nudging individuals in the right direction. If the government is convinced, for example, the individuals are not saving enough for retirement or are making investment choices that are too risky, then it can design savings scheme to encourage people to save more or to invest in less risky assets. The pure consumer sovereignty view would be that the government's business is not to nudge people into choices they can make on their own. Economists favoring this view would suggest that any kind of paternalism requires that some group of people, the government, the elite, the intellectuals, knows what's good for consumers. Although this may sometimes be true, it generally raises several philosophical and practical problems. How can the government make extremely complicated decisions for us? How can we trust the government to really have our interests in mind? How can we distinguish between differences in opinions and preferences and those cases in which people really are making mistakes? Beyond these questions, it is important to note that every government intervention is costly and paid for by tax revenues. Thus, every activity relinquished to the government increases by deadweight loss that society faces. In the end, we urge you to be the judge of how acceptable you find government intervention in individual choices. It is a normative question. Evidence based economics. What is optimal size of government? As you have probably concluded by now, this question is difficult to answer because it will depend on your value judgments. We can probably state with some certainty, however, that a minimal amount of government intervention in the economy is necessary. An economy needs some amount of law and order and some national defense, some regulation and some redistribution, and so on. So, most people would agree that the government needs to be in the picture in some way, but that still leaves a broad range, and you have to you use your own value judgments to decide where you want to be in that range. Economists can be helpful in guiding you within this range and in deciding on the types of activities in which government should be involved. Rather than answering the question, is more government good or bad, economics is useful in helping us evaluate the costs and benefits of government intervention and in suggesting potential ways of designing better government policies. Let's consider two specific areas to make our general point about how the tools of economics can help you think about the optimal size of government. As we have shown, a major efficiency loss of taxation is deadweight loss. Thus, the debate on the reach of government should hinge on the effect of its actions. The larger the dead loss, the worse the policy, all else equal. In those cases with large deadweight losses, one can make the argument that it is a bad place for the government to intervene. The government typically operates in a slow moving manner. A significant drag on the economy can result in regulators cannot move swiftly in response to changing market conditions. We now focus on the first of these and then discuss the second in the books at the end of the section. A first consideration with this approach is that a heavy reliance on income taxation may result in more deadweight loss than a broader spectrum of taxes, federal sales tax, estate taxes, etc. This is because deadweight loss is increasing geometrically with the tax rate. In this sense, when formulating policies, we should always compare the marginal deadweight loss of the last dollar raised from different sources of taxation to the marginal benefit of additional dollar of tax revenue. For a tax that distorts behavior, the marginal benefit may not be worth the deadweight loss, which suggests the need to decrease this tax. Let's think about the income tax more carefully and see if it distorts people's decision to work. At the extremes, in the United States, bulk of tax revenue is raised from income taxes. At the extremes, economists have a pretty good idea of the impact of income taxes on a worker's decision to supply labor. If there is 100% tax on income, then there is really no reason to work. Your your take home pay would always be $0. A tax that large a tax that large is likely to be labeled absolutely inefficient by economists because the cost to society of no one working would be much larger than the tax revenue generated. But what if the tax rate was closer to present levels of the marginal federal tax rate, 25% for someone earning $40,000 a year? If Americans get to keep 75 cents of every dollar that they earn, will everyone stop working, or will they just carry on as if they were no, there were no tax on their income at all? The elasticity of labor supply gives us an easy number to assess this question. Remember that elasticities are just a percentage change in quantity divided by a percentage change in price. In this case of labor supply, the tax rate changes the price of working, how much you get paid, and the quantity is the number of hours worked. If the supply of labor is elastic, then the number of hours someone works is very sensitive to the wage rate. Thus, an increase in income taxes will have a large impact on labor supply. This lost work will create a lot of deadweight loss. But if labor supply is inelastic, then a tax increase won't cause a big change in the number of hours a worker supplies, which means that the size of the deadweight loss won't be large. To estimate the elasticity of labor supply, economists have used data taken from workers' responses to large changes in income tax rates. Early empirical studies found that the Reagan tax cuts of 1980s led to around a 6% increases in the number of hours worked, resulting in a relatively large elasticity estimate. However, when economists used richer data sets to estimate the same elasticity, they found a very small elasticity estimate ranging between 0 and zero point 0.1. As research progressed, economists began to focus on the impact of tax rates on a worker's reported taxable income. Initial analysis found very high elasticities of between 1.3 and 1.5, but much of the early research on this topic looked only at the short run response to higher marginal rates. However, this can be different from the long run elasticity because individuals may respond more strongly to a temporary change in taxes. That is, you may want to work more for a year if taxes are very low during the year, but if taxes are very low permanently, you may not end up working as hard. Subsequent research focusing on long run elasticities in fact yielded much smaller estimates. In general, these estimates suggest that the labor supply results have been decidedly mixed. This is probably why the two views of labor taxation persist today, and why this topic represents an important area for future research. As soon as the estimates begin to point to a smaller elasticity range, economists will be able to provide more precise estimates of the deadweight loss of the income taxation. But the size of the government isn't just a question of how inefficient it is to raise tax revenues. Even if there is very little deadweight loss associated with raising taxes, the sorts of government failures discussed above might also tip the scale against government intervention. Quantitative analysis of such government failures is another active area of current research. The efficiency of government versus privately run expeditions. A glimpse into the possibility that the government may operate more slowly than private profit seeking enterprises is provided by a study comparing the success rates of government funded expeditions to the North Pole and Northwest Passage versus privately funded voyages. The research conducted by economist Jonathan Karpov found that privately funded expeditions were smaller, cheaper, less likely to lose personnel, less likely to lose their ships, and more likely to achieve their objective. Plus, the difference in outcomes between private and public expeditions was large. For example, publicly funded expeditions had an average of 5.9 deaths versus zero point 0.9 deaths per privately funded expeditions. Karpov was able to go a step further and see why privately funded expeditions were so much more successful than the public expeditions. He found that their chief advantage was an ability to adapt to new technology quickly. Many publicly funded expeditions were so slow to adapt to new technology and that they didn't even supplement their crew's diets with vitamin C, even though Knowledge of the relationship between scurvy and vitamin C deficiency had been known for centuries. Privately funded expeditions also developed innovations of their own. Chief among, the, Chief among these was their ability to learn from the native population about shelter, clothing systems, and overland travel. This research provides one example of the nimbleness of the private voyagers compared to that of the public. Although not definitive, it provides an example of how the tools of economics can help you change about the optimal extent of government intervention. How general this result remains a question, but it does illustrate a common criticism of big government. Its slow movement can be a drag on economic efficiency. Summary of the chapter. Government can play an important role in ensuring that markets are competitive, efficient, and equitable. Key roles of the government include taxation to raise funds to provide public goods such as national defense, policing, and infrastructure investments that would not be provided adequately by the market. The use of tax and transfer programs in order to achieve a more equitable distribution of resources in society. And the use of taxes and subsidies as well as regulations to correct market failures. The costs of government interventions must be compared carefully with their benefits. Economics is most useful not as a value judgment on whether government is good or bad, but in understanding what sorts of activities require government intervention.